Hello, my name is Chiara, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is? Well, if you give me a moment, I will tell you. But first, let me tell you about Now and Ruth, the two main characters and POVs in A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. Yes, that same Ruth, but also not really. We'll get to that in a bit. The book is opened by Now, a 14-year-old girl living in Japan who is writing a diary. She grew up mostly in the US since her family moved there for her father's job when she was still very young, but recently they moved back to Japan. Since being back, she's been feeling pretty isolated, different, she's getting bullied, and she struggles with this sense of identity, worsened also by her home situation. She shares pretty early on in her diary that she no longer wants to live and that soon she won't be alive. But before that, she's writing this diary because she wants to tell the world about her grandmother, Jiko, who is a Zen Buddhist and who she admires a lot. The other POV is Ruth, a writer living on a remote island in Canada who one day finds a Hello Kitty lunchbox washed ashore, possibly coming from the tsunami that happened in Japan. The box is filled with different things, including some old letters and a diary from a girl called Now. Ruth is immediately intrigued and, as she reads on in the journal, tries to uncover the mystery that is Now and her stories and her family. This is the broad setting of this story. I don't want to go into the details of where the story goes because I think that would take away from the reading experience, so I just wanted to share the general context and some of the common themes. As I mentioned, the POV Ruth and the writer Ruth are sort of the same person, so let's talk a little bit more about the writing. There's a metafiction element to the book since Ruth is both the reader of Now's diary and the second POV, and this Ruth main character is a Canadian writer, much like, or perhaps exactly like, Ruth Ozeki, the author. These blurred lines between fact and fiction are not only present in the reader-writer relationship that is explored, but also could be seen in some very real issues that the book deals with, especially when it comes to Japanese society and bullying, but also larger as to how we can be so disconnected from ourselves and those around us and from the world and the life you are living. I think this unconventional reader-writer relationship is strengthened even more by the fact that Now addresses you as a potential reader of a diary. It doesn't allow you to be sucked into a fictional world because you feel like you're part of it. And I personally really enjoyed this. It made me feel really present as a reader and kept me engaged in a different way than strong fictional worlds do, but definitely equally so. In addition to the metafiction, there's also a bit of magical realism sprinkled on top as well, which is really nice, in particular in combination with the setting. We have the Buddhist temples in Japan and this remote island in British Columbia, which are both such prime locations for a bit of magical realism. Another thing I wanted to mention about the POVs, that not only are they very distinct voices, you have a 14-year-old girl who is just yapping and obviously losing track of her story most of the time and goes on wild tangents and tells stories with an innocence that covers up a bit of the harshness of the reality that she is facing. Whereas Ruth is a very mature voice and kind of frames these things that are happening to Now in a much more serious and emotional way, which is kind of a reality check for the reader. Both of the POVs are very introspective and observant characters, which I really enjoy, and you really feel connected to their story and their emotions. I also want to mention the humor and quirky style. I think this book was just the right amount of odd and strange, both in terms of storyline, where we really jump from dealing with some pretty heavy topics to maid cafes to Zen Buddhist practices in World War II, back to a cat getting lost in the countryside. But also stylistically, it does not stick to the diary entry, then third person POV and back and forth. There's some things that break that up, which makes it more of an interesting read as well. There's definitely layers and layers of messages that could be taken from this book. I'm sure that when I reread this, I will have other or more takeaways as well, but for now, there's a few things that stood out to me. Through Nao's relationship with her grandmother Jiko, we get a lot of the Zen Buddhist messages. Sometimes it's a little cheesy, but definitely written about in a fun way because they mostly are told through old Jiko, who is definitely the quirky grandma type, or through Nao talking to or about her grandmother. I think it helps that the author is a Zen Buddhist monk herself, so she obviously knows her stuff, and being a great writer, knows how to build them into the story quite well. Jiko's teachings to Nao definitely focused on Nao dealing with her bullying and self-confidence, which was really beautiful to read, but it's also just a lot about life and our place in it, from living in the now, which I think the main character's name Nao was probably purposely chosen. And these reflections on the past and the present are quite frequent and definitely make you think about the here and now as a reader. Of course, a main concept in this book is that of the time being. When I read the title, I definitely thought of it as the time being, as in for the time being, meaning for the present time, which also fits, but additionally it explores this idea that everyone and everything is a time being. This idea that time and being is the same, that time is not separate from you, that we are the present, and time does not come and go because we are being all the time. So it touches on existential philosophy in this very light and hopeful way. It's quite contrary to how more modern existentialist literature might do. So I quite enjoyed the way that that was used. There's also lots of less explicit messages in this book on how we see each other, connect to each other, or forgot to. I can't wait to read this book again someday and just discover a whole range of things to take away from it. Reading this book definitely brought about a lot of thoughts and feelings, because we have two very introspective main characters thinking about life and death. It's impossible as a reader not to ask yourself some of these questions as well. Who we are and why we are and if we're doing it right. I noticed I was thinking about the book, or more the ideas presented in the book, quite often, and definitely still after I read as well. While it is not a novel where I sobbed throughout, there are some really emotional moments and also really uncomfortable parts, especially when it came to the bullying. There are some rather graphic parts describing these instances, and they're really heavy to read, especially knowing that these are realities for some kids. And so make sure to take care if you decide to read this book. At the same time, there are also many positive emotions in terms of finding identity, comfort, connection to family and ancestors. There's an overwhelming feeling of hope and gratefulness to this book, which I really enjoyed. So despite its devastating moments, the overall message is definitely positive and hopeful. Some final thoughts with my final Japanese snack of the humongous pile that my friend brought back from Japan, and I thought was fitting to eat throughout reading this book. I think that Ruth Ozeki's books are just that right amount of strange. It's definitely weird in some parts and has a lot of bizarre moments or lines of thought where you wonder why and how the author came to include this, but it's not off-putting or shocking. And it somehow all fits and makes sense in its own way. I think that some of the choices really make sure that the reader stays engaged and interested in this book. There are a lot of references to Japanese culture, and while most of them are explained to a certain extent, I do think this book is even more enjoyable to readers who do have some basic knowledge on Japanese culture. It's definitely not a requirement, and maybe it's a nice way to explore if you are interested in it or if you haven't had much exposure to it so far. But the perception of how bizarre this book is might increase based on how little you know about Japan. So, like now, I am telling this story in the hopes that you'll read her diary, which is a strange full circle type of moment and end of this book review. There's so much to this book. I really hope you will give it a go. It will make you feel more connected to the world and reflect on life in a very hopeful way. Let me know in the comments if you've already read this book or if you plan to read it. Feel free to also leave your book recommendations. As always, I plan to do more of these in-depth book reviews, so I'd love to hear from you what you think that I should read. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching and have a lovely day.